right, Judges 16, let's call this one Without His Eyes He Finally Sees, because this is the chapter in which Samson, potentially in search for what he had lost in the way of a marriage, is caught up with a prostitute who gets him caught up, but the Philistines still don't know the secret to his strength, so he gets away. But from the prostitute's bed, he ends up loving a woman by the name of Delilah, the famous Delilah. And the interesting thing about that relationship is it talks about Samson loving Delilah, but the story does not describe Delilah as ever loving Samson back. And it's a blessing in some ways in life when you have love that is rejected, but it's openly rejected, especially if it's done in a kind and a courteous way, because there are times when it can be even worse to have your love accepted, but simply for the sake of having it used or manipulated. And that is the trap that seems to catch Samson, as he goes back repeatedly to a woman who does not ever seem to love him, even though she's quite well aware of the fact that at least he's saying that he loves her, and the word seems to make it clear that he does. And so the thing that he had lost in a marriage, as we said, losing sight of what was right in pursuit of simply following what was right in his own eyes. He lost a wife, and now he's not getting that back as much as he might be seeking it in the arms of a prostitute and ultimately Delilah. And so that eventually gets him caught up, because she presses him, or basically in modern terms, nags him until he finally comes clean about the source of his strength. She sells that information to the Philistines, and the Philistines, not content to simply kill Samson, they gouge out his eyes, keep him as a prisoner, and force him to entertain them, which he does until the point at which they lose track of the fact that his hair is growing again. And in the midst of entertaining them, he is able to convince a young man to lead him over to a center pillar in the house where they're having fun at his expense. He pushes over the pillar and perishes with his enemies, leaving us with a number of observations, but one or two that caught my attention was the fact that Samson, even though he seems to die in what is a tragic tale, it's still a tale of redemption. But the other thing is redemption at what cost? See, it wasn't until Samson lost his two eyes that he saw the need for something that a man who was portrayed as more meek or even weak, Gideon, saw from the very beginning. And that's the importance of the word please. See, because when Samson won a great victory in his strength, wielding the jawbone of the donkey, he didn't so much pray to God in a position of humility. And he simply said, look, after giving me this great victory, you're going to let me die of thirst. That's not like any prayer I ever thought of. You see, I've never been given Samson's great strength, and I don't know what it's like to have that kind of temptation, to be that strong, so strong that it's hard to humble yourself to simply ask for the kinds of things in the way that he's now able to ask for them now that he no longer has his eyes. And so even though it is a tale of redemption, the question is, did it have to cost him his eyes in order to achieve the redemption that he seems to have found at the end of this story? And so ultimately, it's the same question for us. We may neither be as gifted, strong, or as mighty as Samson, but the question is, even though we also have a story of redemption, Christ paying the price for the penalty of our sin, much like Samson, him paying the cost of the penalty of our sin does not mean that he delivers us from all consequence of sin. And so even though I would ordinarily have never filmed a video in the dark, it kind of caught my attention that, wait a minute, in some ways this is nothing in comparison to what Samson had to endure toward the end of his life, in comparison to a judge like Gideon, who started out seeming relatively weak, but simply had a steady path towards the redemption that God gave him without the loss of his sight. So my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we learn to appreciate all the blessings of redemption without the unnecessary consequences that can come from, as we see in the life of Samson, doing what's right in our own eyes at the expense of understanding what's just right.